On November 15, 1884, European leaders met in Berlin for a conference that would change the course of African history. What did they discuss? How did they decide which African territories each country could claim? And how does this still affect us today? Let's find out. We often think of world history as being shaped by wars between nations, but there's another type of conflict that's just as important, the scramble for Africa. In the late 19th century, European powers began competing to acquire African territory. This was driven by several factors, including the desire for raw materials, new markets for manufactured goods, and the belief in European superiority. The Berlin Conference was called to address the growing tensions and conflicts between European powers regarding the colonization of Africa. The main objective of the conference was to regulate and contain the European colonization of Africa. By this point, European powers had already colonized almost all of Africa. So the conference wasn't about who would colonize Africa, but rather how to divide the continent so that everyone could get along. The conference was also meant to prevent another costly war like the Crimean War, which had been fought between 1853 and 1856. To understand what happened at the conference, it's important to know a little bit about the participants. First, there were the great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, Portugal, and Russia. Then there were the smaller powers, Belgium, Denmark, Spain, and Sweden and Norway. Of these, only the United States was absent. The US wasn't invited because it didn't have any significant colonial holdings in Africa. In fact, the US didn't even have a permanent diplomatic mission in Berlin. At the time, most of Africa was still under the control of local rulers, although some areas had been colonized by Europeans. For example, in 1881, Britain had taken control of the entire eastern coast of Africa from the British Cape Colony to the Egyptian border. They also controlled the northern Nigeria area and the small island of Zanzibar. France had colonized Senegal, the western Sudan, and the areas around the French Congo. Portugal still held Angola and Mozambique, while Spain had colonies in Equatorial Guinea and the Canary Islands. As you can imagine, the African rulers were not happy about this development. They had fought back against the Europeans, but they were no match for the superior firepower of the colonial armies. As a result, many African rulers felt that they needed help, and they hoped that the Berlin Conference would provide it. However, they had another thing coming. During the conference, the European powers decided that Africa would be divided into two zones. A and B. Zone A would be the areas where Europeans could colonize without restrictions. Zone B, on the other hand, would be reserved for Africans. In practice, this meant that Europeans could do pretty much whatever they wanted in Zone A, but they were supposed to treat Africans more humanely in Zone B. But as we all know, Europeans didn't really respect African rulers or their people. So this division wasn't really enforced. The Berlin Conference is often criticized for giving European powers free rein to colonize Africa. And that's fair. But it's important to remember that the European powers were all fighting over Africa. Without the conference, it's likely that there would have been a lot more violence and instability on the continent. Additionally, the conference did establish some guidelines for how European powers could colonize Africa. For example, all colonial governments had to guarantee freedom of trade and navigation on the Congo River. They also had to abolish slavery and protect indigenous cultures. Of course, these guidelines were often ignored, but they did set an important precedent for how colonial powers should behave. The legacy of the Berlin Conference can still be seen today. Many of the borders drawn up at the conference are still in use today, and many African countries are still struggling to break free from the economic and political constraints placed on them by their colonial rulers. However, it is important to remember that the Berlin Conference is the only reason why Africa is the way it is today. There are many other factors that have contributed to the challenges facing African countries today. Nevertheless, the conference was an important event in world history, and it's important that we understand what happened and why it matters. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, please hit the like button.